Hey everybody, Jessica Morrison, Realtor with Century 21 Sheets. We are back for, I think, our third interview with Andrea Davis and Hand Incorporated. Andrea, thank you for being willing to come back.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you guys just had your annual summit talking about affordability in Hamilton County, surrounding housing and even rentals. Maybe just let's just jump in and talk. What's on your attention right now? What's on your radar?
Well, I think a lot of people are paying more attention right now to housing affordability since COVID. I think we've seen home prices really just kind of skyrocket, as well as rental rents are going up, in very aggressive ways that a lot of us, who sort of um, live paycheck to paycheck, it's difficult to contemplate, your rent going up $300, $400, $500 a month, just, kind of like that. So that's the good news for us, is it's causing a lot of people to talk about housing and to think about housing and to acknowledge the fact that our supply of housing in the suburbs maybe doesn't match our needs for housing, as we have become less of a bedroom community for folks who work other places and more of a economic engine of ourselves. In and of ourselves, the need for housing to accommodate our workers has increased, and that kind of the difference between the increasing values, costs of homes and rents and incomes, which are pretty, maybe they might be inching up if you're lucky, but I don't, I think the statistic that we shared at the conference was home prices have increased 88% since 2010. I think it's a pretty safe assertion that very few people can say the same about their incomes. I know my income has not increased anywhere near 88% since 2010. So, that just is making it more difficult for more people to afford to live in Hamilton County and other suburban communities that have really been built to be places people want to live. So that's the good news, and also the bad news, because it means we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I mean, props to the city for creating such great places to live that a lot of people want to live there. And so we have capitalism where, just supply and demand and who's going to pay for it. And so that's a very healthy thing. It's just obviously we need to, I'm glad you guys exist so that we can be mindful of the other side of that. So
I mean, part of what we love about living here, right, is the amenities.
Yes.
We like, we can go to IKEA, we can go to Topgolf, and we can, eat at pretty much any restaurant you can imagine. But that takes workers. And if the workers can't afford to live somewhere near where they live, then it becomes more difficult to sustain those amenities that make this such a great place for us to live. So It really impacts us all.
Yeah. So is there anything like from a public-private partnership that you've seen be successful, where maybe you have these larger corporations coming in, building a large facility, for example, that's really going to change the landscape in an area, or add a reason to expand utilities, and therefore the urban sprawl is going to happen. Are you seeing anything that helps housing be more successful in affordability or creative solutions by having a public-private partnership?
We're not seeing a lot of that yet in Hamilton County. Still it's very market driven. We still have cornfields that can be developed into housing. But what I'm starting to see in some other communities is employers actually, private businesses that employ a lot of people, recognizing it's difficult for us to find employees, right? Cook Group, I believe, and also Cummins down in kind of south of Indianapolis, both have implemented programs where they're developing housing for, that will be made, more affordably than the market can provide it. And then they'll make that housing available to their workers. So it's kind of a, it's self-serving in that it helps them address a problem they have. But I think it's really encouraging to think about someone other than nonprofits and government thinking about housing and figuring out sort of how they can be a part of that. It's a little bit different than a public-private partnership where, developers work with municipalities to, maybe they get land, maybe they get funding or TIF district or whatever. But One of the things Hand has benefited from is a partnership, a philanthropic partnership with the Hamilton County Community Foundation and Central Indiana Community Foundation. Their goals, and they have three, kind of primary goals. One of which is to foster inclusive economic growth, which means, people who want to live here should be able to live here and improve their lives. This is, the land of opportunity. And although we weren't able to, we would have loved to get, a grant for one of our properties. What we were able to, we have a property we're working on, a development. We are actually going to break ground next month in Fishers to build 11 units of rental housing on, just its own little neighborhood. But between when we applied for funding for that project and when we went to start construction, the costs went up. The construction costs are increasing exponentially. The cost of labor is going up. Interest rates are going up. So the project got, increased in cost by 30%, pretty much overnight. And we had to kind of, what can we do? Because in order to get the funding, you have to show financial stability for a project, and the rents, obviously, if we're charging affordable rents, there are limits to how much we can charge, and so that means there's a limit to how much money we have available to pay for construction. So we weren't able to borrow any more money because we couldn't raise the rents enough to repay the money. But what we were able to do is work with the community foundations and a subsidiary that they have that works on impact investment. So these are donors and philanthropists who have capital available that they don't necessarily need to get a market return on, right? They could invest it, but instead invest it in something that has a better return. Instead, they're investing it in us. We're getting a $1.4 million loan at about 5% lower than we could get from any bank right now. So
that's awesome.
It allowed us to borrow more without increasing our repayment obligation. And so if not for this loan, we would not be able to do the project. So that's the kind of creative thinking I think that we need to do more of, both, with charitable organizations like that, but also with municipalities and counties and townships and school districts that maybe have access to property that they don't need or they don't have plans to use, and could kind of lower expenses that way, because there's not much we can do about the cost of construction, unfortunately.
I'm going to ask you a question that you're probably, I don't know, it's kind of out there, but it ironically has come up when affordability has entered discussions with friends about housing. So, following this thought process of sustainability, I can say it, where like just the concept of, and I hate how it almost sounds cliche to say it because I feel like it's kind of become a buzzword, but we have a lot of neighborhoods that aesthetically have grass that doesn't get used, and then that disrupts the ecosystem of wildlife and animals and stuff. And I'm totally sounding like a hippie here, but just trying to be very thoughtful about this, in that, land is precious, it is limited, which is why we've seen an uptick in multi-use come about. So has there been any discussions, or maybe what's prevented this type of housing product coming up, where it's almost like a community that, everybody maybe has a tiny home or is sharing kitchens, or just thinking about like the thoughtfulness of how we use space, and even like a community garden, where could a neighborhood in itself be self-sustaining? And I think that was especially highlighted during COVID.
Right.
And we're feeling that now in our in inflation, in our grocery bill. And so how, trying to answer those questions of how can we be more self-sustaining or self-sufficient?
For sure.
And this may be, I don't know if it's too county specific, but just like have those discussions taken place, and in turn, what's maybe keeping those from coming about?
I think there's definitely more discussion now in the suburban context about building like mixed use neighborhoods, or neighborhood sort of nodes where, it's walkable. That's the key word now, right? And you say sustainability is kind of the buzzword, but really it's walkability.
Yeah.
And what you hear that people want, what residents want, is to live in a walkable community where, like, when I grew up in Fort Wayne in the city, right? And I could walk to the 7-Eleven and get a slush and a candy bar, and I could walk to the pizza joint and pick up a pizza, or the gas station and get a soda. And if you think about the way the suburbs were laid out with the endless cul-de-sacs and, major arteries that were designed, to get you to your job quickly, now that we're living here and there's places to eat and there's entertainment, we want more of that kind of old school city vibe where you have your neighborhood retail and you catch up with your neighbors at the bar on the corner, when you all go on Friday night. And so it's difficult to sort of retrofit the suburbs to that, the existing developed areas. It's really hard, to Carmel, being the exception to that, just taking the scorched earth approach to it. But it's hard to take a cul-de-sac neighborhood and make it walkable, mixed use, and that's where things like trails help. So there's definitely, I think, a movement in that way. I'm not sure, we're going to get to the point in the suburbs anyway, where, we get back to that old, where everything, your doctor's office and your school and everything is within walking distance. But I really feel like there is a desire to go back to that. When you hear more people talking about wanting that than wanting half-acre, lots that they have to take care of and spend their weekends, worshiping, basically.
Yeah, I think I would almost argue, even just paying attention to our local demographic. We live in Indiana. And I'm not saying that everybody in Indianapolis wants to own a farm, but the quantity of people who want to or love the idea of having chickens, having goats, and being able to go out and have plenty of sunlight to have a vegetable garden, or just like this return almost to an agrarian type of society where, you can go out and be able to, like, if the grocery lines did shut down, could we provide for ourselves in our neighborhood? And we've gotten very far away from being able to do that or manage. And I know with zoning, there's some limitations with livestock. And
yeah.
So like,
I know more people in Indianapolis who own chickens and goats than I do up here, and that's zoning, right?
Yeah.
Here, the suburbs sort of developed as single family neighborhoods with commercial, strips here and there. And it's only really in the last, I think, 10 or 15 years that communities, at least in Hamilton County, have really started to think, what do we really want to be? Like, do we want to just be endless subdivisions and strip malls, or do we want to, have more of a downtown and an economic development strategy and things like that? But you mentioned tiny homes. That's the biggest obstacle to tiny homes, because that's a frequent one I've heard sort of bandied about as, a solution for homelessness, or, as transitional housing. Like, why couldn't we have, a tiny home village? And the reality is there is not a community in Hamilton County that I'm aware of whose zoning would allow for a tiny home. I remember a couple of years ago, Fisher's actually changed their minimum lot size and minimum home size requirements and reduced them as a, mostly an acknowledgement of what the demand was. People want smaller homes. They don't necessarily want the 3,000 square foot home anymore. But they made a point of saying this is not, to make them more affordable. This is just because this is what the market demands. But the reality is, the smaller the home, theoretically, the more affordable it is.
Yes, theoretical. I mean,
you can certainly build a very expensive tiny home, but
even an RV, like something popped up on Marketplace the other week where it was like $300,000 for an RV. I'm like, I need to think about this lifestyle for a minute.
Right?
Like,
my husband used to actually design brochures for an RV manufacturer, and they had $1 million RVs. Like, this was the lifestyle, right? You'd leave your $6 million home for the summer and travel around in your $1 million RV. I mean, I guess it's
props to them,
Right? If you can have it,
yeah,
good for them.
Good cup of tea, I suppose. But
Yeah.
well, thank you for entertaining that tangent for a minute because it has come up. So it sounds like the biggest obstacle in keeping that particular type of development from coming about is zoning.
For sure.
And then also getting maybe a developer behind that because money really drives a lot of that. And you're not going to make a ton of money on a tiny home community or something
unless,
like that.
I mean, it depends on who you're building it for. I mean, I think developers will build whatever people want them to build, whatever they will pay them to build, right? But the obstacle is zoning because, we live in an area that was all agricultural. So pretty much any vacant land is going to need to be rezoned. And that, kind of brings out the opinions from folks who perhaps certainly have opinions, but maybe not a lot of actual knowledge around some of these topics. So
I mean, if you find an individual with no opinions, Andrea, I think that'd be a miracle.
They probably wouldn't fog a mirror, I'll tell you that. But zoning is obviously a topic of conversation. The folks who work in housing like I do have, it's a frequent topic of conversation. And I think it's really interesting that we are starting to see some communities, not here certainly, but some communities sort of relax that a little bit. Minneapolis actually did away with single family zoning at all. Like it's either residential or commercial. And if it's in a residential area, you can build what you want to build as long as somebody's going to live in it. And, and that kind of does harken back to the neighborhoods of our youth, right? Where you had, the apartments on the corner and then, maybe a couple duplexes and some single family homes. And
yeah, actually, that's a good question. Do you know why we aren't building more? Like, I know duplexes have started to make a comeback, but like, do you know why we don't see more fourplexes or 6 or even 8plexes? Like occasionally one listing comes up downtown and I'm just like baffled by it because it's like, wow, that was a different time period.
Yes, it really was. It's density, most zoning, so like a duplex is considered single family attached. So you may be able to have a duplex in a single family zoned neighborhood, but typically like zoning will say you can only have one primary residence on a lot. So if you have one lot and two, so you're, even if it's residential, even if it allows duplexes, most often you're still going to have to go through a public process. And especially when it comes to, quadplexes or 6 or 8, because, that's occupying what, like quarter acre, and the zoning for that is, 6 units an acre. And you've got 6 units in a quarter acre, and that just throws everything off. So yeah, it's all math. I think most communities, the hand tends to build smaller developments, typically 11 units or less if we can, for our typical, annual effort to add some housing. And so there's a little bit more flexibility with that than larger developers who come in and say, we want to put 200 or 300 units in. Like it's easier to find room for 10 units than it is for 200. And 10 units isn't as likely to sort of change the character of a neighborhood or a city or whatever than, 200, 300 units, you're your own community, right? And yeah, we want to blend. So.
That makes sense. So is there anything project-wise that's on the table right now within Hamilton County that, you just really wish people would think twice about, or maybe talk to their local government? And I'm not looking to stir the pot here, but just, I think a lot of times we see news headlines or we hear a project and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And then it's like, oh my goodness, if you only knew.
Right.
Is there anything that you kind of wish people would think twice about?
Not really. I mean, I think, one of the reasons our housing costs have gone up the way they have is because of a shortage of supply. Believe it or not, even as quickly as Hamilton County has grown, we really haven't produced enough housing to keep up with the growth in population and jobs here. So in my mind, any new housing is good housing, right? Market rate housing, folks who can afford market rate housing, if they are moving out of some of the lower end housing into this brand new stuff, that just creates more opportunities for folks who need, some of the more affordable older product. It's interesting to me that we really had a battle, for example, to get our 11 units approved to be built on 2 acres in Fishers, where I see, we're taking down, like there's a project actually right near my house in Fishers where 16 homes, single family homes were acquired, and they're proposing to put in over 250 apartments. And the outcry about that 250 apartments coming into where 16 homes were is not nearly as much as when I want to put 11 units where one home was. And I find that interesting, the kind of double standard that density is okay if it's market rate and it's generating the taxes, but it's not okay if it's folks who need a little bit of help. I find that interesting, but generally, I think.
Do you think some of that is because of the publicity that it's going to get? Like, oh
I
my
think
gosh, we have this new community coming in.
I think you mean the support for the bigger project?
Yeah.
I think that's part of it. It's sexier, right? You know, we're going to have these $2,000 a month apartments right on the trail, and you know, it's sexier. But you know, all new housing is good in my opinion. I just wish, you know, those of us who aren't working on the market rate side of things could get a little bit more support, both from the public, which I think is just kind of a fear of the unknown. You know, a lot of people kind of have this instant reaction when they hear that we're proposing to build housing, you know, that's attainable to folks who don't make very much money. That, you know, oh, our crime's going to go up, our traffic's going to go up, you know, our housing values are going to go down. And all of that has been proven in study after study after study to not be the case, but the myth perpetuates. You know, that, you know, it's sort of accepted as fact, even though we can show study after study after study that says it's not. You know, if a neighbor comes and says, my housing values are going to go down, I don't want you to approve this, then almost always your elected official is going to say, you're right, and I'm not going to approve it, even though the community needs it. And so.
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge the public if that's your gut reaction. Like, if somebody walked into a health clinic and said, I need help, you know, do you think that person is trying to be responsible? Do you, like, I just feel like it takes a lot of courage and humility for someone to vocalize that they need help, or to admit, hey, I need to look at an affordable option. Like yes, like, could there be individuals who are crying? But like, let me ask you this in turn. What happens if we don't help these people?
Absolutely.
That's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where if somebody does become desperate because they can't get help in a healthy capacity, you are going to be perpetuating crime. So
absolutely.
I'm sorry that is the stereotype, but I'm also thinking in my mind about how every now and then you see on Facebook chatter pages somebody vocalizing that they need help. And, you know, there are some scammers out there, like that does exist, but the amount of people who want to pour out, or on the flip side are critical, like I just, it's interesting to even just watch on those little instances where people are receptive of that. And so I hope that maybe this conversation on some minute level can be helpful in changing that mindset, because asking for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength, and it will be an asset to our community. Because, and then have you seen from your experience with these communities where people get into a better position and then
absolutely,
so that somebody else can come in?
Yeah, our communities up to this point have largely been for seniors. You know, folks who have lived in the community, raised their kids, you know, don't want the responsibility of home ownership anymore, or can't afford it, trying to get by on, you know, $1,000 a month when rent is 15. But we have, you know, starting with our, we have 14 non-age restricted apartments in downtown Noblesville, and we have 2 sort of units for families in Carmel as part of a senior. We have a senior property with 2 family units in the middle of it, to kind of create that intergenerational feel. And although the folks who live in those haven't yet moved on, I can tell you one of the residents of those, because of the stability that having housing she could afford for her family gave her, she was able to finish her doctoral degree after moving into one of our properties within, like, you know, she'd been working out for years and years and years, and within like 6 months of having stable housing, finished her doctorate, and, you know, is now teaching, you know, at a major university in central Indiana. So, you know, everything in our lives really revolves around where we live. And if we don't have somewhere we can go home to at night that we know like it's going to be there tomorrow and I can stay here next week, you can't start thinking about addressing your health issues or, going back to school and finishing your education or, starting a workout plan. If you don't know where you're sleeping tomorrow night, all of that is just like, you're never going to improve that. And we hear a lot about mental health and the mental health crisis that everyone has. And I firmly believe if you look at the statistics, which I do not have in front of me, and I will make up generally, but a frightening number of households, I just put this in an email so I know it, it's 15% of all of the households in Hamilton County pay more than the recommended 30% of their income for housing. So they're burdened by the cost of housing here. And some of that's by choice, right? You want to pay a little extra to have the house with the pool or whatever. And some of it's by choice because the schools are good here. And so, renting an apartment in Fishers might cost 40-50% of my income, but by gosh, my kids are going to be in the best schools they can possibly be in. And you make that decision. And so all we're trying to do is provide housing for those families that doesn't take 50% of their income. So they can start to think about saving for college or buying a new car or, some of these things that when you live paycheck to paycheck and most of your paycheck's going for your rent, there's not a lot of other options for other things. Here's a statistic. We have more than 40 food banks in Hamilton County actively handing food out.
Wow.
This was pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, more than 40 food banks. Why? We're one of the richest counties in the state. It's because people pay too much for their housing. And when you pay 50% of your income, pre-tax income, mind you, so the government still gets its cut on housing, you don't have much, you might run out of food before the end of, before your next paycheck comes. So
how much of that, do you know, Andrea, if you're able to look in the data and see like the price points of the homes or like how affordable those homes are or how like length of residency where like, I'm just curious because that tells a big story.
It really does. Yeah.
I wish we could dive more into that.
Yeah. And that data is there. And I think, certainly it could be, we could dive more deeply into it. I don't know those things off the top of my head, but when
I had no idea though on 40 though,
yeah.
that's a lot.
Yeah. When you asked about the housing projects, and are there any housing projects that, as I said, all new housing is awesome, but I did want to mention the one trend that we are seeing, everybody's seeing, I'm sure everywhere, is, the Hamilton County in particular didn't have a lot of sort of old housing stock. If you look at like the age of housing in Marion County versus Hamilton County, I mean, like something, again, I'm making this up, but something like 80 to 90% of all the housing in Hamilton County has been built since 1980. I mean, and that's pretty modern. But what we're starting to see is the handful of little kind of old neighborhoods being, that's the project I mentioned in Fishers where the 16 homes were taken down. These were 16 very modest ranch, homes that probably were the most affordable single family homes that you could possibly get in Fishers, right? They're gone or they're in the process of being removed right now. And they're going to be replaced by this, what has proposed to be a 6-story apartment complex thing with amenities and whatever. And there's another street in Fishers just south of 116th Street that was kind of like old Fishers that had, very modest homes. That's all gone and has been replaced by $1 million homes. And progress is great. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't help our affordability challenges if we're taking, what is sort of naturally affordable and replacing it with things that 90% of us, I think, would probably say are not affordable to us.
Well, yeah. And I see both sides of that discussion and it feels closer to home for me than maybe it might be expected because, and I think that the biggest avenue of vulnerability there is the fact that all of those lots are probably not in a homeowners association,
right? Where
there are not covenants that restrict the tearing down and redevelopment of those lots. And so an investor is able to take advantage of that. And I would almost say, residents, if they wanted to potentially partner together to create their own little HOA. You could draft covenants that, and I know like the neighborhood that I grew up in, had a third of an acre, like 1,400 square foot ranch built in the 70s, like classic, but it was 2 blocks from the high school. And like, I know for a fact that that neighborhood is going to get targeted because of its location. There is no HOA, and it's, and it grieves me to think about the house that I grew up in being demoed, or someone not having that type of lifestyle or access.
Not being able to, where's the starter home, right?
Yeah. I mean, I almost wonder too, what's keeping, like, I'd love to see the math, because a lot of it tends to come back to money. But like, what would happen if the city was able to, instead of those being 200 apartments, what if those were condos and people were able to have ownership? Because I feel like the rental side is almost, and I can't say like, I don't mean to chastise like the county for this, but just, again, money drives everything, it seems like. But, if we, instead of approving a project that is going to be rental focused, if you're trying to meet mixed use, you need to look at it from an ownership perspective. And then you get into like condo HOAs, especially on the newer construction side, tend to be horrifically expensive each month.
Yes.
So, can we solve things there and make that more attainable? Like finding an HOA that for a condo that has sub 200 or sub 250 on a monthly basis, like they're out there. You just gotta
really look though.
And it might not be like the ritzy new construction. But I guess I just hope that maybe if somebody does watch this who has influence, can maybe think about that from an ownership perspective more than rental. Because I think the idea, like, I don't want to be saying two things at the same time. Like, it does grieve me to see accessible entry-level housing disappear. And, if the city is like, well, we want it to be prettier, then could we create a grant program or a scholarship that helps maybe a resident who is limited on income improve their yard? Because, if the city recognizes, oh, this is one of the main houses on this street. And, then you get into private property and all that, but just,
so first the city has to acknowledge the value of that. Property, right. And that's, so like the city of Noblesville has a facade grant program where it helps owners of commercial businesses on the square, because Noblesville historic square is one of its selling points, but also home or property owners in residential neighborhoods that are historic. So if you're in a historic neighborhood, obviously the city values that and they want it to look good. They don't want it to look run down and whatever. So you can apply for grants to help fix up the exterior of your house, which I think is fabulous. Yeah,
because I think we do want it to be a win-win. It's just, how are we going to go about solving it? And I think anytime you can get more people into ownership, we ultimately as a community win long-term. But
for sure. But I think you really do need that full spectrum of housing, because there's some people that just aren't ready for a home ownership or don't want the responsibility, don't want the ongoing whatever. There's still people for whom rental is the ideal situation. And maybe eventually they'll buy a condo or a home or whatever. But, we want people here, whatever their situation in life, right? And so you really need that full continuum of housing, because I've been a renter, I've lived in a mobile home, I've owned, single family homes, and throughout, and I expect to have several other living arrangements in my next, 30 years or so. So if it's not all here, then I've got, I don't want to move to Indianapolis when I'm ready to retire, because that's the only place I can find a ranch that I can afford. I want to be able to stay in my community. So I want my community to have those options available to me.
Sure. Well, is there anything, Andrea, in closing that, I know you talked a lot about the benefits of,
I'm a little biased,
like the philanthropic efforts and how far that goes, but is there anything you just want to make sure that we leave our audience with?
I would say, just if you're interested in housing and you understand the need for a variety of housing opportunities, tell people. When we propose a project, as I said, folks come out of the woodwork who don't know anything about it, who don't understand why the community needs this, but aren't shy about sharing how they feel about the project, how they feel about how it looks, you know, everything. We need more people to come to those meetings and say, you know what, by gosh, we need this. I have a daughter who just graduated from college and can't afford to, you know, to move in the same community where she grew up, and she wants to live here. And I don't want her to live in my basement. We need people to share those stories. And we need, you know, even the people who need affordable housing, you know, as you said, it's very brave to even ask for help. It's even braver if we can tell their stories, so that we can dispel these myths that the only people who live in this housing are, you know, lazy, non-working, you know, they're just all these misconceptions. And the reality is, these are folks who live here already that just need a little bit more affordable option. And maybe, yeah, someday they're going to buy a house and create a space for the next family who needs a little help. And
Or just like what you mentioned earlier, like this lady was able to get her doctorate and now she's able to contribute to the local economy, and she brings a great amount of job talent that she didn't otherwise have, and that adds to like her income and like changes her family tree, and like,
and her kids have stability. So, you know, she's got 2 in college now, I think, you know, so that could have been a very different ending if she had not, you know, if she had taken them to the shelter, which was her next step, had she not been able to you know, move into this home. So, you know, I just really appreciate the fact that you and others are interested in this topic, and we really are starting to see more people sort of get it, you know, why we can't just have $1 million homes. You know, I shared before you started recording, we've had more $1 million home sales in Hamilton County in 2023 than sales of homes under $200,000. And that's just kind of mind blowing to me. You know, my first house cost $50,000, and I don't feel that good, but I guess I am.
Yeah, but you know, on a county level too, I think the average income is 6 figures in Hamilton County. So you've got the income to support it, but
well, the average is misleading, right? Because you have outliers. Really,
sure.
If you look at the median income, you know, it's a little bit more. It still has outliers, certainly, but
Sure.
Even earning median income, it's very difficult to afford to buy a home in Hamilton County. Our median home sales well north of 350,000 now. So
Yeah, which is wild. I remember when I first 9.5 years ago, I remember when it was just starting to get over 150 for across central Indiana, and now it's 290.
Yeah, it's progress. Yeah, but
well, thank you, Andrea, for your time. If you are watching this video and would like to financially support the work that HAND is doing, Andrea, what's the best way for people to do that?
You can just go online to www.handincorporated.org, and that's all spelled out. So, or you can, Jessica can connect with me if you have a connection to her.
Sure. Well, thank you again, Andrea, for your time. It was a pleasure once again. And
thank you for having me.
For the great discussion.
Awesome. Thanks so much.